So now we come to Imelda's question, the literary sources of the sermon. So where did this come from? Where did Matthew get it? Well, for most people, the best answer seems to involve the Q hypothesis. Okay, what we're dealing with here is a classic example of Matthew and Luke, each independently drawing on and making use of the Q material. Okay, and on particular points of detail, they say this is a bit of an issue, but overall, we still think Q is the best explanation. There are other explanations. There are people who will argue that Jesus gave the content twice, once on top of a mountain in a longer form, and another time when he wasn't on a mountain, it was a shorter form. That's a way of, if you like, defending the literal truthfulness of the way the two different Gospels describe similar events. It's the same logic that would say that the rich young ruler is not simply the one story being remembered in three different ways by the Gospels, but they are three different events. Three different rich people came up and knelt down in front of Jesus and asked exactly the same question and got slightly different answers depending on whether it was this day or that day or the day after. Now the more respectable academic process is to say, no, this is the tradition at work. And that's what we're dealing with in case of the sermon. So a less developed form appears to be preserved in Luke, and that's the SP, Sermon on the Plain. Interestingly, that will be confirmed. I did a quick look to see what Brisbane says about how he deals with it in his reconstruction of Marcion's Evangelion. And just a reminder, Marcion's Evangelion is a document that we know existed, unlike Q. There actually people argued about it, commented on it, quoted from it, and said it was a terrible thing and he was a nasty man for putting it out. Nobody said that about Q. Okay, Matthew and Luke quoted it, if you like, but they didn't tell us they were quoting it. Okay, so whereas Q is a kind of scholarly reconstruction, a hypothetical reconstruction to explain Matthew and Luke, in the case of Marcion's Evangelion, we actually know the document existed, and we've got masses of excerpts from it by independent ancient writers from the 2nd and 3rd century who said they were reading and quoting from Marcion's text, and they're not friends of Marcion. They were critics or opponents of Marcion. So in terms of historical method, you can see that what Brisbane and others have tried to do is actually a project that's plausible, which is, okay, we've got so many people quoting from this lost document, I could actually reconstruct the document based on their quotations. Okay? Now, in fact, we actually did that, not me, but scholars did that in the 1980s with the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were not being released because the scholars who had been assigned the different documents to study and translate were keeping them for their PhD students to work on and were not publishing them. But they had prepared a concordance, a computerized concordance of all the text. So if you looked up a particular Hebrew word, you'd get all the occurrences where that word occurred in the Dead Sea Scrolls with 2 or 3 words either side. Okay, well then you just, with a sophisticated computer program, you just do a reverse concordance and you reassemble the text. So somebody did that and all hell broke loose. You've broken our copyright, you've done that. But once it was out there, they said, oh, all right, and they released all the documents, and sure enough, what the concordance had generated was bang on the money because it was just a reverse concordance. Okay? So in effect, we can be, I think, reasonably confident that while we may not have everything that was in Marcion's Evangelion, Marcion's Gospel, we've got, I think, a pretty reasonable intellectual process around this project. And it's actually more defensible, I think, than the Q hypothesis. And here's the critical edition of Q. Even bigger than the Sermon on the Mount, okay? And of course, Q didn't exist. But here's a scholarly, critical edition of Q. All right? Yeah. So it's like when you look at the commentaries, the letter of Philemon is less than 1 page of the New Testament. You try and find a commentary on Philemon that's only 1 page long. They're all 100, 200 pages long, because it generates this whole industry, which you know about with essay writing. So if we go into Marcion's Evangelion, so let's do a check. Does he have the Sermon on the Mount? Yes, he does. He has something remarkably similar to Luke chapter 6. Okay, except that verses 32 and 33 of Luke chapter 6 are missing from Badoon's reconstruction of the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, now that could be because it wasn't in Marcion, though that particular saying or whatever wasn't in Marcion's Evangelion, or it could be that it was just never quoted by any of the early fathers who were attacking Marcion. So we can't say for sure that Marcion's Gospel did not include what we call Luke chapter 6, 32 to 33. All we can say is that in using the methodology that Badoon uses, reconstructing Marcion on the basis of quotations in other writers, nobody ever quoted Luke 6, 32 to 33 as being in Marcion's Gospel. Okay? So in broad terms, with except for 2 verses, we have if you like, another example of Luke's Sermon on the Plain in Marcion's Evangelion, for what it's worth. Okay. Lutz himself proposes that there were 2 other pre-existing collections which Matthew has used and edited. So what Lutz is saying is that Matthew inherited the short form of the sermon, more or less, the Q version. Okay. But then he's also had 2 other documents which were available to him. One is the antitheses. Say that after a couple of scotches, and you might have depending on your tendency to lisp, you might have an interesting experience. Okay, so these are the 6 statements. You've heard it, but, in the past, but, that set of material. What he's saying is this existed as a set before Matthew got his hands on it. Okay. And the other one is the piety regulations, the bits on either side of the Lord's Prayer, basically, which give instructions about how to practice your piety. Okay, don't go around blowing trumpets. Don't go around showing people. Don't put ashes. This is the passage we read on Ash Wednesday, just before we invite people to come up the front and do exactly what Luke chapter 6 or Matthew chapter 6, tells us not to do. I mean, it's fascinating how we do that. Okay.
So, Greg, what you're saying is these may have existed just in oral form, or they may have existed in written form as separate sort of sections of Jesus' teaching or saying.
What Lutz is arguing is that both of these, the antitheses and the piety regulations, were inherited by Matthew as texts, and his reason is because Matthew then edits them and introduces other Q material to supplement them. So he's saying Matthew is actually editing these 2 chunks just as he's editing the Q sermon. So in effect, Matthew's had 3 basic sources: the sermon, the yes but stuff, antitheses, and the piety regulations. All of which, particularly, these 2 other sets are very Jewish. Okay. As in, what I mean by that is, characteristically, the sort of stuff Matthew seems to be interested in, and which Luke is not interested in, because Luke is more invested in the Hellenistic world. Matthew is more invested in the Jewish world of Jewish piety and Torah observance, and the antitheses is about upping the ante on Torah observance, getting to the heart of Torah. And the piety regulations are about not focusing on external expressions of piety, but getting to the heart of piety. So they're both they're sort of classic Jewish texts. They're not in any sense anti-Jewish, they're thoroughly Jewish. Okay, and it's some of the sort of Jewish commentary, of course, over the years. They may not like Matthew very much, given the way how he gets into the Pharisees in chapter 23 and so on, but they love the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is pure Jewish theology. Absolutely pure Jewish theology. There's nothing Christological about the content of the Sermon on the Mount. Okay? So Jewish scholars can get into this and love it. Now there's another book I often use, and I haven't mentioned it so far here, and that's a rabbinic commentary on the New Testament by Samuel Lachs, L-A-C-H-S. Rabbinic commentary on the New Testament. Unfortunately, only one volume ever came out, but it's the volume that does the Synoptic Gospels, and it's great. It gives you all the sort of rabbinic parallels to the material in the Gospels. I'll grab it in the break and show it to you. And again, so people like Lachs, they celebrate the Jewish wisdom of Rabbi Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. So again, the Sermon on the Mount becomes Jewish property when they're using it, rather than simply Christian property. It's only fair that occasionally we let them have Jesus back, since he was Jewish after all. Now, Betts actually suggests that the Sermon on the Mount, as we have it in Matthew, had already gone into all this editing and so on before Matthew, and Matthew has simply taken it on board. So he's giving Matthew a less creative role in the forming of the Sermon on the Mount. Okay? Whereas Lutz is going to argue that there is a pre-Matthean version of the Q sermon, what he calls Q Mat, but that the final editing, that what Matthew has done is to combine that with the antitheses and also with the piety regulations. He's chosen, as we'll see in a moment, to focus on the Lord's Prayer, and then he supplemented all of that with other bits of Q that occur elsewhere in Luke, and Matthew has chosen to use them as part of his great sermon. Now, whether that's done by Matthew or whether it's done by somebody called Matt, 10 years earlier, doesn't really matter. Okay, for me, it's what we're saying is there's a history of tradition, and there's a process of forming, and it's some of the material presumably goes back to stuff Jesus actually said. Others has been remembered, and in the spirit of Jesus, new material's been created in the life of the church. And then we see versions of that in Luke and in the Marcion's Evangelion, and as the underlying structure of Matthew. But in Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount develops even further into a much more integrated, worked up document, which may well have existed even before Matthew took it over. Now, if we're going to say that, we've got some interesting timeline issues as to how documents get created and passed around and people become familiar with them and so on. And that works better if Matthew is on the other side of 100 rather than before 100. I'm not claiming to have the answers here, obviously. I'm just kind of throwing out the issues. We need to have some take on those issues as we go into doing it. So now for some of the big picture stuff. Lutz argues that there's a double set of literary structures involved with the Sermon on the Mount, and this is all part of his saying, wow, look what we have here, kind of stuff. There's an external framework that kind of demonstrates the significance of Matthew 5, 6, 7, and there's an internal structuring of Matthew 5, 6, 7, which also indicates something very particular. So let's jump into it. I gave up trying to do this in Keynote, and I just went to a Word document, saved it as an image, and pasted it in because I thought, this will drive me nuts doing this in a Word document in a thing. So I hope it's visible, and you can check it later on. So, and I've tried to color code it so it's easier to see the different parts. So this is it's an example of, say, a chiastic structure, chiasm. So what he's saying is that Matthew 4:23, Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, claiming the good news of the kingdom, curing every disease and every sickness, has an inclusio with Matthew 9:35. Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, curing every disease and every sickness. If Jesus was handing in an essay for me, you know what I'd be writing in the margin. You've already used this bit. You can't repeat it. But you can repeat it if that's what you're doing, if you're deliberately structuring stuff. And particularly if you're giving an oral, if you're preaching, it's often great advantage to repeat the same phrase. Okay, and even in the same point, even at the same point of the sermon, and just tweak it, just change. You might have the same 3 or 4 words, and then the next word is different, and then you repeat the same 3 or 4 words and add another word in, and people get it. They take it on board when you start to repeat stuff. Okay, and that's what Matthew is not writing an academic essay. What we have in the Sermon on the Mount is something intended to be, in fact, in Matthew's Gospel, is something intended to be experienced orally. Okay, and so Jesus going about all the cities and villages teaching, and I mean, I can basically read it from either spot, and I'm reading the same words.
Does John do that as well?
John does it a lot, particularly in chapters 14, 15, 16 and 17. He goes round and round in circles. And the structure of the farewell discourse in John 14, actually 13 to 17, is not a continuous line. Actually, it's 16 because 17 is the prayer in the garden. But 13 to 16 is not it's a spiral kind of structure. So on the outer brackets, you've got Jesus running around doing all this stuff. Then in Matthew 4:24 and in Matthew 8:16, you've got the idea that Jesus' fame is spreading and people are bringing to him the sick and so on, and he's dealing with it. Okay, so that's the bracketing, which is black on the screen. Then you get yet another pairing, Matthew 4:25. Great crowds followed him from the Galilee, from the Decapolis, from Jerusalem, Judea, from beyond the Jordan. It's a bit hard to imagine, actually, but we get the point. This guy is becoming well known. Okay, and Matthew 8 verse 1, and great crowds were following him. And then finally we get into the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 verse 1, the first part of that. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain. And then in chapter 8, first part of verse 1, when Jesus had come down from the mountain. So there's again very clear bracketing of the stuff in between. Okay? Not unlike, I'm not suggesting Matthew had this in mind, but not unlike when you're doing Pentateuch. Remember back about 10 weeks ago when you were doing Pentateuch, some of you? If you look at the Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers material, basically you get to about chapter 19 of Exodus, and you've arrived at the foot of Mount Sinai, and you don't move until about Numbers chapter 10. And everything else that happens for the second half of Exodus, all of Leviticus, first half of Numbers, the tribes of Yahweh are camped at the base of the mountain. Okay? And so they've arrived at the mountain, and then you get all the laws and dong, 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 and then chapter 10 of Numbers, they make the preparations to depart from the mountain. And everything in the middle has been set of the people camped at the base of the mountain and Moses going up and down and so on. There's a similar kind of thing here. But Matthew 5 verse 1, Matthew 8 verse 1, where Jesus up the mountain, Jesus comes down from the mountain, then we've got this cluster of material which is the Sermon on the Mount. Okay? So that there's a structure now. One of the difficulties with Matthew that he uses the same phrases so many times, people find inclusios all over the place in Matthew. But Lutz is arguing that there's a clear framing of the Sermon on the Mount with this kind of material. My problem with that is I can see that, but I'm not sure what. And I can see that the last paragraph of chapter 4 is very much setting up what's going to follow. What I don't quite get is what Matthew would be trying to achieve by the other parallels in 8:1, 8:16 and 9:35. I can't quite get what Matthew would be expecting his audience to pick up. Matthew 4, 23, 24, 25, they're just the last couple of sentences before the start of the Sermon on the Mount. So you got proximity. 8:1, that's fine, but once you get to 8:16 and 9:35, you've actually moved so far away from the sermon. That's where I think Lutz is stretching it a bit. But point's valid, it's there, but I'm not sure that it has the same significance as he might be suggesting.
And I guess the question there is what is it teaching? It's really like sometimes we can be, I think, get so focused on the text when a lot of oral, like I can see that you would naturally use a lot of repeated phrases
Yeah.
if you're just telling a story, you know.
Yeah.
And I wonder, we get the microscope down on this text sometimes, and sometimes, and I can't quite see the point of it. If it doesn't always sort of further us in our understanding of the text or the cultural world, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and that's the limitation of putting intense literary analysis onto material which, while it was written, was primarily supposed to be experienced in an oral culture. Okay. Certainly Matthew would not have been intending or imagining that the people consuming his text had a copy on their lap. He'd be assuming they're sitting in a house church somewhere and they're hearing bits of it read out, even big chunks of it read out, but not following, with their finger on the scroll, following word for word and making sure the person up front doesn't miss any words or anything. That's not the picture. So but still, there is this larger structure, and it would certainly, I think, Matthew has deliberately located this body of work on the mountain. It's a speech on the mountain. Okay, the other stuff is it's there. I'm just not sure it's as significant in Matthew's mind as it is in Lutz's mind. However, this one gets a bit more interesting. This is actually looking at the Sermon on the Mount, and so what the colour coding there is intended to be helpful. So obviously it's focused. What Lutz is arguing is that the Lord's Prayer is the very heart of the Sermon on the Mount, and that all that Jesus' teaching about the righteousness which is expected of people who are disciples or participants in the kingdom of heaven is crystallised and is really about the Lord's Prayer. Now that's a significant exegetical point. This, in terms of exegesis, by the way, this is where this is a very clear example of where getting a sense of the structure, of the wider literary structure, could inform your exegesis of a particular passage. So you could say, well, I'm doing an exegesis of the Lord's Prayer, but I can't do that without noticing the literary structure of the Sermon on the Mount, which according to Lutz says it's all about the Lord's Prayer. Okay. Now, this is his particular contribution. I think I find it a fascinating and insightful insight. Okay, contribution. So what he's arguing is that obviously there's a sort of internal chiastic structure to the Sermon on the Mount, and I'm not going to go through the thing line by line, but you can sort of see how his mind is working in terms of that internal structure. Now, in the 15 minutes or so that are left, we're going to try and just focus briefly on chapter 5. Okay, of Matthew, of the Sermon on the Mount. So there are 4 major chunks in chapter 5. There's the description of the situation, first couple of sentences. There's what's called the exordium, which is kind of the warming up the crowd and giving them a sense of what kind of a show this is and what kind of characters or themes and so on they might expect to come across. Then you get the introduction to the sermon, Matthew 5, 17 to 20, and then you get the first major part of the sermon, the antitheses. And then chapter 6 and 7 we won't even try to discuss in today. So starting on the situation, Jesus moves away sees the crowds and he goes up the mountain. Okay, so there's a distancing of Jesus from the crowds. Is it a retreat? Yeah, we get similar kind of moments in Mark's Gospel where Jesus crosses the lake to get away from the crowds. In this case, he's moving away from the crowds up a mountain. Okay. And I'm not even going into the question, what mountain are we talking about? Mount Tabor? Is it, there aren't too many mountains as such in that kind of way, but we get the general picture, and it's more a literary theme, I think, to invoke the idea of Moses going up the mountains. Yeah, so we get the phrase, he goes up, so that's a bit of bad typing, he goes up the mountain, and we get 4 other places in Matthew where Jesus is up the mountain. Okay, Matthew 14, Matthew 15, Matthew 17, which is the Transfiguration story, and Matthew 28, which is the post-Easter appearance on the mountain in Galilee. Okay, so it's worth looking at those and seeing if there's any kind of thematic connection in Matthew's way of using mountain as a location for a significant event. There is an echo, but I agree with Lutz. It's only a very vague echo of Moses and Mount Sinai. This is a totally different kind of scene. I mean, apart from anything else, in the Sinai traditions, the people are not allowed to come onto the mountain. Okay, they build a fence around the bottom of the mountain to make sure no cattle and no people go, because if they step onto the holy mountain, they'll be zapped and killed. This is not that kind of thing. Okay, it's a very, very faint echo of just a mountaintop experience. Jesus is up on the mountain and giving the teaching and so on, and the people are with him. Jesus sits to teach, which is a typical rabbinic pose. So he's being represented as a rabbi, as a teacher. And the disciples come to him and he begins to teach. Now, of course, by this point in Matthew's story, there are only 4 disciples, so it's not a large crowd. Now, of course, in the world of the Sermon on the Mount, and even in the larger scene, the assumption is there's more. But if you actually go back and read the early couple of chapters, by this point in the story, there are only 4 disciples. He hasn't yet chosen the 12. Okay, that's going to come later on. So again, mental pictures. I'm sure you all were thinking there were at least a dozen men and maybe a few women sitting around his feet. No, well, according to Matthew, not yet. But of course, the whole picture is wrong. It's not just for 4 people plus a few randoms. Okay?
Large sermon for a very small congregation.
Well, I guess you could take it as a text. You don't, like the old joke of the young minister who goes to a country church. There's only one farmer there, and he says, "Oh, I don't think we should have a sermon." "No, you've done the work. You should still do the sermon." So he preaches a 45-minute sermon. At the end, he says to Jack, "So what do you reckon?" He says, "Well, if I go down to feed the cows and only one cow comes up, I don't give her the whole truckload." All right, so the setting is there. Now, the setting, of course, is surely, that's Matthean redaction. I mean, this upper mountain, sitting down, disciples coming and so on, that's presumably Matthew at work, fitting it into his story. But who knows? That's ultimately the big chunk. The first big chunk, of course, is the Beatitudes in the first section of Matthew chapter 5. Now, Beatitudes itself are not unique to Jesus. They're not unique to the New Testament. It's classic wisdom literature. It's the blessed, fortunate, happy, successful, Makarios. Some of us are old enough to remember when the leader of the Greek community on Cyprus was Archbishop Makarios. Okay, it's just the Greek word meaning blessed. The Arabic word is Mubarak, the same word, blessed. Okay, so this is a common genre within wisdom tradition, and there are dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of Beatitudes in the Bible. Okay, so if you go to my Jesus database page and just go to the article on Beatitudes, okay, there's the Beatitudes from Matthew, but then you get examples from the Psalms, from Proverbs, from Jewish writings in the Second Temple period, Qumran, and in other early Christian texts. Okay, so there's no shortage of examples of Beatitudes. So it's not like, wow, Jesus invented Beatitudes. Nope, not at all. Okay, Jesus is using Beatitudes, but it's not something that's unique to him. There are 8 Beatitudes in Matthew. Again, this depends how you count. Some people talk about 9 Beatitudes, and even 10, and get all lyrical about the significance of numbers and so on. But I think there are 8 Beatitudes in Matthew. The first, the second, and the fourth are found also in the Sermon on the Plain in the Cube material. So Beatitude 1, 2 and 4 are shared by Matthew and Luke. Which means, of course, 3, 5, 6, 7 and 8 are not found in Luke. The first and the last of them, when they talk about the reward, says, the kingdom of heaven belongs to these people, whereas the others have different rewards or different expressions of blessedness. So again, there's a kind of inclusio between Beatitude 1 and Beatitude 8, which both have this long, the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Okay. In Luke's version of the Beatitudes, it's second person address, you. Blessed are you poor, blessed are you who mourn, blessed are you who are hungry. Okay. In Matthew's version, it's blessed are they, so it's shifted to third person. Okay. It's more traditional in the biblical beatitude tradition to use third person. Happy is the man who, da-da-da-da-da. Okay, third person. So for that reason, scholars would argue that the Q version with you is more distinctive, more perhaps typical of Jesus. But as time went by, Matthew is an example of it dropping back into the more usual mode, which is to express a beatitude in the third person. Okay? But, given that Jesus wasn't speaking in Greek, it's a bit of a moot point as to what's going on here. So just running very, very quickly, what I've tried to do is the ones that are, the bits that are underlined are the bits that are common with the Q tradition, okay? So the poor in spirit, this is in Matthew's version, kingdom of heaven belongs to them. Those who mourn, they will be comforted. Those who are meek will inherit the earth. That's not in Q. Those who are hungry and thirsty, and for Matthew it's not really hungry and thirsty, but hungry and thirsty for righteousness. Similarly, the first one in Luke, it's blessed you who are poor, blessed are you poor. In Matthew, it's those who are poor in spirit. So there's a kind of a spiritualizing, theologizing of the unusual circumstances. Those who are merciful will receive mercy. Again, that's not in Q. Those who are pure in heart will see God. That's not in Q. Blessed are the peacemakers. They'll be called sons of God. That's not in Q. These are distinctive Matthean Beatitudes. And number 8, blessed are those who are persecuted, and so on. That is found in Luke, but it's not seen as original to Q. Okay, because it's a totally different kind of beatitude. In the earliest version of Beatitudes, those who are poor, mourning and hungry, just pronounce them blessed and happy and fortunate, rubs against the grain. So scholars say, well, that's Jesus. He's wearing his hat backwards. He's not following conventions. And to say the poor are blessed, the mourners are blessed, the hungry are blessed, that makes you stop. What do you mean? What do you mean? In what sense can they be blessed? That's Jesus at work. Okay? Those who are pure in heart, those that are being persecuted, well, of course they're blessed. I mean, that goes with the conventional view of religion, that those who do the right thing will be rewarded by God in the next life. That doesn't sound like Jesus. That sounds like any old Jew, any time in the Second Temple period. That's not a distinctive point of view. That doesn't mean Jesus couldn't say things that other people agreed with, but how to identify it as a Jesus-ism if it's in fact common wisdom? And that's one of the dilemmas for the criteria for historical Jesus research. Okay, so we do find blessed are you when people persecute you and so on. That's in Luke 6 and it's in Matthew 5, but it's not seen as part of Q. Okay.
If it's in both.
A Q is not simply what's in Matthew and Luke. When you try to do a reconstruction, because you've got to say, well, why? What's going? So there's more to the defining Q than simply saying it's where Matthew and Luke overlap. It's not quite that simple. Now I haven't actually checked to see what these people do with that particular saying, but that's where the critical. I think they'll be arguing. I expect them to be arguing that the poor, the mourners, and the hungry, that's Q, whereas the those who are, or that's original, and that the persecution of the for sake of righteousness is not historical Jesus, but it might be Q. So you get layer upon layer in that kind of an argument. Okay. So I probably didn't express that quite clearly. What we're saying is the beatitude for those who are poor, those who mourn, those who are hungry or thirst, it's shared by Luke and Matthew, definitely in Q, and many people would see that as historical Jesus. The extra saying appears, even in Luke and Matthew, appears to be secondary, although it could be in Q. But some scholars will identify 3 layers of tradition in Q. Q1, Q2 and Q3. Okay? And then there's the other stuff, the meek, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, they're the holy Joes, and it's got nothing to do with Jesus.
I mean, this may be beyond the scope of where we are here, but I was under the impression that Q was drawn totally from the overlap between Matthew and Luke.
No, it's not quite. That's a little bit too blunt an instrument.
Okay.
And particularly now we've got possible reconstructions of Marcion's Evangelion, which is an independent witness to Q.
Okay.
But even within Q, there are people like Kloppenborg, who's one of the editors of this, and you met John last year in Bethsaida.
Yeah.
John Kloppenborg, Canadian scholar. Anyway, he was there. He digs at Bethsaida. He's looking for Q. That's the joke. He's always looking for a document of Q. Okay. He's not really, but I mean, just in case this goes viral. You know. Within the Q material, the earlier material seems to be, it's to do with consistency, and within the Q material, there are, you can see, John would argue, you can see a reworking of some of the Q material as people get more frustrated with the lack of response, and so people like Crossan and others will distinguish between Q layer 1, layer 2, and layer 3. Okay, but yeah, we won't stay on it now. Now, if we jump across to Luke's version of the Beatitudes for a moment, you get similarity and dissimilarity, which of course is fascinating. Okay, so we get his 4 Beatitudes, only 4. Blessed are you who are poor, blessed are you who are hungry, blessed are you who weep, blessed are you when people hate you, revile you, persecute you, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Now the problem there in both Matthew and Luke is that last one is much longer, much more complicated. In that sense, it's a secondary beatitude. It's not the crisp, poke you in the face kind of statement like the first 3. But, and here the red and the grey are not to do with the seminar, okay? It's purely just me distinguishing the lines so it's easy for you to see them on the screen, okay? So on the other side, we have woe to you who are rich, for you have had your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, you will be hungry. This should be slightly confronting for Westerners. Woe to you who are laughing now, for your time to weep will come, basically. And woe to you when everybody says what a great job you're doing. Okay, so when the parish thinks you're doing a great job, you're in trouble. All right? You can see why nobody wants this guy to come to church. I mean, you wouldn't want him on parish council. He's high maintenance. Okay? All right? So this is Luke's version of the Beatitudes. And see, it's a beautifully constructed set of blessings and curses. And Matthew has not interested in the curse side of it at all. But he's inherited the 4 positive ones. The 4th one gets bumped down to number 8, and he inserts 4 others. Now, when I say he, Matthew, or the tradition before Matthew, has already expanded this. And so the 4 are Q, but the first 3 are earlier, and the last one appears to be a secondary development, and even the wording and so on is quite different. But the really unique thing about Luke's version is we get the 4 positives and the 4 negatives, which is, whereas Matthew has 8, that are all positive, and they also tend to be more spiritualized than Luke's, which are more in your face, matter of fact. Okay, running on just really quickly, and then we'll try and wrap this up. Salt and light. These are the two little kind of, not parables, but sayings that work with themes around salt and light. Collections of sayings. Sorry, we do find a sort of a version of this in Mark, but Matthew has picked them up and recycled them in this location. There's a bit of an echo in 1 Peter 2, and Lutz believes that 1 Peter is actually is evidence for Matthew's reception. Okay, that when 1 Peter talks about people seeing your good works and glorifying your Father in heaven, it sounds awfully like Matthew 5. He is actually referring to Matthew 5. He's not an independent witness for that saying. So that would give us a tradition history kind of fix on Peter and Matthew. The thematic collections are probably pre-Matthean, and they're to do with key words and catchwords. And to go back to Jamie's question a couple of weeks ago, I think the difference between a catchword and a key word, if there is one, is that a catchword is when two or three sayings are put side by side because they happen to have salt in them, for instance. Whereas key words are words like justice and righteousness and the big theological words. But you get little words that recur in a saying, and they become the reason for those things being remembered as a set. So they're almost like strips of Velcro that mean certain sayings get stuck together. Oh, speaking of salt, dunk, 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 dunk. I can give you some sayings about salt, but they're not. But salt's not a key word in the sense of a big theological word. That's probably, if I was trying to separate them out, that's probably what I'd be doing. So this probably represents, again, the oral tradition for the sake of memory, clustering together sayings about salt and sayings about light and so on. Okay, and these are, of course, very traditional exhortations to virtue, even though we can't figure out, particularly with the case of the salt, what on earth that means. Okay. You don't add salt to dirt. You are the salt of the earth. I mean, that's... Okay. Earth must mean the world, as in human society, not dirt. And you don't throw salt. Salt cannot lose its flavour. I mean, that's impossible. Salt's a raw chemical and it never loses its saltiness. Okay, so these are sayings that don't make sense on one level. Another level, we can see what he's saying. Okay? So that logically the sayings are like, no, there's something wrong here, but we sort of get the point. And probably shouldn't try and make too much of that. It's just that they're kind of a bit odd if we try and... They're not self-evident, self-explanatory. Okay? But they're exhortations to virtue. What I want to suggest, I think, is really the significance of salt and light is actually saying, listen up, okay? I'm about to give you some stuff which is like salt, which is like light. If you want to get the significance of Matthew 5:13 to 16, read the next few verses. I think these are texts whose significance is not in and of themselves, but because of what they invite the listener, the attitude they invite the listener to have for the rest of what follows in the Sermon on the Mount. Okay? So to follow the ethics of Jesus is to be salt, is to be people of light. And I think it coheres on that macro level where it doesn't cohere on the micro level of, so explain to me again how salt can stop being salty. I mean, that's actually a non sequitur. That does not compute. Okay? A bit like when you walk in the room and someone says, oh, you're here. Yes. Did I am. But I mean, what's the point of that? Yeah. Okay? So in the case of the next paragraph, which is kind of really the introduction, so the Beatitudes and the salt and light are kind of the exordium, the proper rhetorical introduction to a speech. And now we're moving into the actual speech itself. We've established the theme, which is about how to be truly blessed, how to be truly happy and wise and successful. And we've established that it's about taking on board issues of salt and light and being followers of Jesus and following his ethics. Now we can move in. That's the kind of opening cycle. Now we can move into the main part. We have the introduction and the first major set of points. So we have 4 distinct logia, 4 distinct sayings, verse 17, verse 18, 19 and 20. Each of them would need way more time than we can get. But again, they're fascinating and they're distinctive in the kind of the way they celebrate the place of Torah within the Jesus community. And I'm sure had Paul been asked to do a pre-publication review of the Gospel of Matthew, he would have put a blue pen through verses 17 to 20. Okay? I doubt that Paul could have agreed with Matthew. And I find it fascinating. This is how Matthew prepares the ground for the antitheses. Remember, verse 17 is, I've not come to destroy the law and the prophets. I've not come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've come to fulfill them. Not a tiny dot or scratch is going to be different. A yod or a tittle, not a yod and not even one dagesh, and not even a dot. Okay, not the tiniest marks of a Hebrew manuscript are going to be irrelevant. I mean, I'm a detail person. Okay, Jesus is OCD, according to Matthew. He's not a big picture guy. He wants the details, and he wants the details to the letter. And that's a very different Jesus than we get in other parts of the New Testament. Okay? So Jesus is not abolishing the law, he's extending the law, and what we see here, of course, is Matthew's attitude to Torah. Okay? Matthew is a Torah-observant Jew. And we see a similar thing later on when Matthew does the rich young man story. Okay, amongst other things, Jesus says, so if you want to be perfect, this is what you've got to do. That's the distinctive Matthean bit in the story of the rich young man. Okay, so Matthew is seeking perfection in Torah observance by the people of his church community. That's a very different expression of Christianity than what you find in Paul or John. Okay, so then jumping into the antitheses, again, each of those is at least a lecture. Hey, I mean, killing, adultery, divorce, swearing oaths, non-violence, non-retaliation, loving the enemy. Okay, I mean, there's masses and masses of stuff here. And in each case, the structure is the same. In the past, you've heard this, but I'm telling you now the standard's up here. Okay, this is rigorous, it's uncompromising, and the church has spent most of the last 2,000 years explaining away that he didn't really mean that. What he meant was do your best in difficult circumstances. We can't expect too much. That's not what Matthew is saying. Okay? So, in terms of Jesus and Torah, the authority for Jesus is, of course, that he is a Torah teacher. He's the preeminent Torah teacher for the Matthean community. And the significance of Jesus is coming through in that way as well. He's more than a teacher of Torah, he's actually a source of Torah. Okay, and he's radicalizing the Torah and giving fresh Torah. So when we, from Matthew's community, we want to say, what does it mean to say this will not, the law and the prophets will not pass away until everything is fulfilled? Well, this is what that means. Okay, it means not only compliance, it means increasing the level of compliance, increasing the standard of compliance. This is what not passing away means, this is what fulfill looks like. And so at the end of the series of antitheses, the last verse in chapter 5, we get this classic statement from Matthew. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. I mean, wow, that's really, it's the same kind of process as John has, with the great commandment, love one another as I have loved you. And we think, oh, that's nice, we can be nice and loving to each other. Well, okay, try practicing it. Matthew has a similar kind of gold standard. Okay? And the standard is nothing less than God. Okay? Be perfect as your Heavenly Father is perfect. So on that note, we'll break for coffee. Let me just put up the principal literature, and I'll go and grab the Samuel Lack's book as well. But Hans Dieter Betts' Hermeneia commentary on the Sermon on the Plain, as well as his article in the Anchor Bible. Allison and Davies in the International Critical Commentary, again 3 volumes, and they use really small print, so there's a lot of words on their pages. And then, of course, Lutz's commentary on the Hermeneia series as well, and a zillion others. I mean, every commentary on Matthew deals with the Sermon on the Mount, and there are dozens and dozens of volumes in the library just on the Sermon on the Mount. And as I learned on the way into work this morning, the Sermon on the Mount even has its own library code. Okay, so 226 is Gospels, okay, and 226.1 or something is Matthew, and so on, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, etc. And 226.9 is Sermon on the Mount. So it's such a significant body of literature, it has its own catalogue number in the sort of Dewey catalogue system. Again, that says something about the significance of the Sermon on the Mount and also the vast amount of literature around that topic.